This is actually a very interesting presentation and today. And what this is about is it's about how attorneys fall on different ranking systems and also how law firms fall on ranking systems. And we came up with this because when we're trying to match attorneys with law firms, we want to make sure that we're sending attorneys that match the quality of a law firm. So if somebody is at a very good firm, we don't want to offend them by sending them a bad firm. And if a firm is not a good firm, they typically don't want to hire people that are from really good firms, actually. And it's also conversely, we don't want to upset candidates by sending them to firms where they're very likely to get rejected. So it's a whole way to rank candidates and firms. And I think it will be interesting for you because you'll be able to see how we analyze people. And I developed this because I learned about this. My dad did a lot of admissions work for Harvard University for a long time for their entering classes, and this is how they would rank people back then. And this is a long time ago. I mean, obviously, when I was when I was younger, but taught me how they did this. And so this is something that I've imported and used to BCG. And I don't know if Harvard still does it anymore, but this is the way they used to do things. And then, so what I'll do is I'll give this presentation today, and after the presentation, I will take questions about this, and then also anything that you guys have, any other questions really about anything at all. But this presentation is good because it shows you where your limitations are and how you can improve. And it also shows you how you can think of firms where you're working and should be helpful at all. And we discuss these ranking systems almost on a daily basis at our company. And in addition to this, I will also probably pass out or show you another document that I was going through with some of the recruiters and people here the other day. And this is interesting because it'll show you the firms that you can get into. It'll show you what you need to do in order to get into better firms. And it's overall just a very interesting, I think, presentation. And so a lot of attorneys don't understand why they're not marketable to certain types of firms. And then at the same time, law firms don't often understand why they can't attract certain types of attorneys. And this presentation really today is going to track why certain types of law firms are attracted to certain types of attorneys, and also why and how that whole process works. And as I said earlier, our job in this business is to try to send people the most appropriate firms. And so we're always trying to move people to a better firm than they're at. So if you're like a lower ranker, we want to move you to a higher ranking firm, and vice versa, but rarely, but that's our job. And so we can't obviously send candidates to firms where the candidate's not suited to it, because then what happens is the firm is upset and may not want to work with us again. And then it makes it look like we don't know what we're doing. Attorneys and law firms just need to be matched in a manner that works for both of them. And then it's interesting also because there's a whole, the more I understand this business, the more I understand this business, the more it almost seems like that there's a whole kind of class system present. And a lot of times people don't understand how the class system works. And you have all these different classes of attorneys and classes of people working in law firms. And it's interesting because it's very difficult to move up from the class you start out at. And what we do as recruiters is we try to move people up this kind of class levels. And then everything that I write and these webinars and so forth are trying to show you how to move upward and what's possible from where you may be now, or where you started, or where you're trying to get back to. And so this ranking system goes from 1 to 5. And when someone comes into our system, I typically will review the candidate first and rank the person, whether or not they're a 1 to 5, if we decide to work with them. And it's formerly was used by Harvard. I don't know if they still use it, because I don't know anyone in the admissions office there, but this is how the college used to rank people. And they would rank them on different criteria. It wouldn't just be an overall ranking, but ultimately they would have an overall ranking, but different criteria. And then what it measures is just whether a gap in the recruiting for college realm. It just shows you how you would be competitive for a school. But I like this really for BCG attorney search as well, and it's the thing that we follow. So this is the way that Harvard ranked applicants to their college. They would rank people of 5 that would be almost very likely to be admitted. They would have the highest test scores, very good grades, really good recommendations, and also often something that made them very special. So it would indicate, promise to do something great in the future. So it would be they might win a Westinghouse Prize, they might be a child actor, an author, or just a really good athlete. So they have a whole package and everything going for them. And it's not enough to have just high test scores generally. It's not enough to just have good grades. You have to have other things. And these sort of people make up a very small percentage of the applicants to a school like that. And it might be a very, I don't know what the percentage would be, but they're not, it's definitely in the low double digits or something like that. And these are the people that everyone, when they graduated from college or high school, and everyone in the town probably remembers them 20 years later because that's how well they were doing at that time. And I guess it says here I guess they might make up 10 to 15% of the classes at a school like Harvard. So it's a very small percentage of people that have that and are fives, and then you have the fours. And a four would be the majority of admits. So they would have really good test scores, great grades, be very driven, and have more than just academics. They would be doing other things. Maybe they did a lot of extracurricular activities and played varsity sports and stuff. And they were just not as, they weren't world class like a five. So they might be, when they got to look at them, they would look at things like how good their high school was, the number of AP tests, the classes they took, and how hard the classes, the extracurricular activities, their interview, diversity, geographic location, legacy, recommendations, and so forth. And these people would probably also qualify to get into other Ivy League schools. If they apply to 5 Ivy Leagues, they probably get into 2, maybe 1. It doesn't, depending. It just, they're great candidates. They're very good. They're rare, but they're certainly not clear admits. And these are the people that most admissions committees spend a lot of time talking about, and most of them are rejected, but they're reviewed very closely, and then they use all of these things like I showed you here earlier, extracurricular activities, number of AP, and they just distinguish do things. If you're in Montana where there's not a lot of good people applying, you might be more likely to get in. So they can use all these different criteria to weight the application. And then these people are really the majority of a school like Harvard. They're probably 75 to 80% of the class. They're just really good applicants, and they would have great test scores and everything's really good. They're just not like a 5. And then the 3 is someone not as strong as a 4, still a really good applicant. There's nothing wrong with a 3. They would probably have taken some AP courses, maybe a lot of them. They may have other things, like they may get really good SAT scores but not have the best grades, or they may have had some things like all A's and B's in their junior year and all A's, and there's just an even academic performance, a really good academic performance, but not the best. And then they may have also had some extracurricular activities. And so these people also get admitted to places like Harvard. You can certainly get in as a 3, but your odds are very slim. Maybe 5% of them are offered admission. They might get on the wait list, or other things could happen, whereas the majority of 5s are going to get admitted, and maybe 20% of 4s, or maybe a little bit more at a school like Harvard back then, but now then maybe 5% of 3s would get admitted. And then they're just not special, because they might get admitted for reasons like they're really good athletes, and so they get a preference to get in a sports team there, or they're very gifted in some discipline, like they took calculus at the age of 10, or public famous parents, or something unusual. So a lot of times they're admitted because they're very special. There's just something unusual about them. They may have grown up in a horrible neighborhood, or they're just great things. And these type of candidates too generally could very clear admits to schools that might be ranked like below 15, and maybe not all the top 10. They could get into some of the top 10, but at a 15 or below school, they would probably get into a good portion of them. And they may be, I would say, probably a little bit more than 5%, but they're probably maybe 5 to 10% of the class. And then a 2 rarely gets into a really good school like that, but it's possible. They generally have okay grades, meaning they're not bad grades. So they might be like a B student, or even sometimes maybe even a little bit below that, but B student, and they might get in. There are probably 15, 20 people in a class of Harvard that are a 2. And where I went to school at the University of Chicago, there were certainly probably 15 people, and everyone knew because they just weren't pulling their weight. And the reason it typically is there's just generally some special reasons. So sometimes they have a rare talent of achievement. That might be the child of a faculty member, a very important person that gave a lot of money. They could have other special reasons for being admitted, and typically that's not easy to admit them. There's a lot of debate. People get mad on the admissions committee, and there's just a lot of argument, and someone really has to push hard behind the scenes to people to get that person into a school like Harvard, not necessarily. And normally, if there wasn't something special in the background or someone pushing for them, they would probably automatically be rejected, meaning their scores are not good enough to even get looked at by a human, or they might get glanced at by a human, but they're not good enough to really be talked about and reviewed carefully. And so someone else is typically pushing them. And a lot of them, these two candidates, are really not even qualified to go to your highest ranked state schools like UCLA, Michigan, or Virginia. They would generally be rejected by those schools just on numbers alone. And they're typically about 1% of the class, maybe sometimes a little bit more, maybe sometimes less, I don't know, but just not a lot. And they also many times are not even capable of doing the work. Like where I went to University of Chicago, there were some people like this, and they needed tutoring on algebra, which is astonishing because you have to take calculus at Chicago to even graduate. So they're just somehow they get in for reasons that aren't really clear, but there's usually something behind them. In case where I went to school, there was one of the people that I'm thinking of there was one of the grandson of one of the founders of the school. So it's things like that. And there's typically, sometimes those people are admitted because the law school is trying to provide unusual diversity to the school. So they could be things like foreign students who are held in prison for their beliefs, things like that, or they're just very close to the school somehow. And that's really how that would work. And I'm sorry, these are one candidates are admitted probably less than 1% of the time, or one in 500 times. And certainly schools like Harvard will let them in, and there's reasons for it. And if you're a child of a faculty member stuff, you're not going to get into a school like Harvard if you're a one. Even if you're a famous faculty member, you're not going to get in. And most one candidates probably wouldn't be able to get into most very selective colleges with a acceptance rate of 50% or more. They're just the majority of students in the United States. And so there's nothing wrong with any of this. And it's just one would be for a school, a super competitive school would be more average. And most discussion and most of the people firms are looking. The college, Harvard is most of their time is spent on 4 people, which are just the people that are giving everything they got and doing really well. Then they just have to sort among the 4 candidates. And I did hear a funny story once about Stanford, and I didn't think it was true, but then I heard a guy that actually told me that it was true. Because I think he'd worked in the admissions office there, but there's so many 4s and there's so many good things about them that if you take like a handful of 4s, how can you possibly distinguish between 5 people that were all the editor-in-chief of their high school newspaper and did this other stuff? And I guess there was a story once where they just threw a bunch of the applicants down the stairs because I had to choose 5 out of 50 or something, or 5 out of 20. I don't know what the number was, but then they picked the ones that were the closest to the bottom, which I thought was funny. And then I was at a conference years later, after hearing that story, like 15 years later, and then I heard someone talking about that, and it actually turned out that he was from there, and it turned out to be true. So I thought that was funny. And okay, so this is the next thing and this is decades ago that this happened, so it's not anything to get interested in now. But so here's what we do at BCG in terms of how we rank our candidates. We have a very similar type of ranking system for attorneys and that come in to work with us, and we want to make sure that we're working with people that are sending them to appropriate firms. Prestigious firms generally, the most prestigious firms generally require their attorneys to be 4s, and most legal recruiters, and we don't really care as much about this as we used to because we work with 1 candidates, 2 candidates, 3 candidates, but most recruiters, when they call people on the phone and so forth, they're looking for 4s. And the 4s are people that are at most big firms and have been able to do well and are making the highest salaries and stuff. And there's not a lot of 5s out there. There are some 5s, but most of our candidates we work with are going to, the ones that for big law firms are going to be 4s. But the majority of candidates we work with are not 4s. We work with 3s and 2s. The 4s are the ones that typically are most likely to get the biggest law firms, and sometimes 3s and even 2s. And I'll talk to you about that. But most of the people that recruiters are interested in, and most of the large firms are going to be interested in and get the most interviews are going to be fours. That's just kind of how it is, and that's the majority of candidates we work with. And pretty much, if someone's a 4 or 5, we'll always work with them. We'll work with now. We typically, this is based on an older article. We work with most 3s now, so we didn't used to, and then we'll work with some 2s and some 1s. It doesn't, but we're not as certainly selective as a firm as we used to be, because we're just getting better and better at our work, and there's just a lot of opportunities out there, even for 1s. So it doesn't really matter where you fall in. But the people that are typically the most in demand are going to be the 4s and the 5s for the big firms. And most candidates that apply, I would say we work with, are 95% of people are a 3 or below, which we can certainly work with 3s. And there's nothing wrong with being a 3. But if you're not if a 3 candidate trying to get into a 5 firm, it's obviously not that easy. But this is kind of how the process works. And then we recruit for lots of firms that are ranked a 1, 2, and 3. And there's a lot of really good firms that are 1. And people do very well financially at a lot of these 1 firms, and you can have a very good career with many 1 firms. And so there's nothing wrong with working in a 1 firm. And certainly we help 4 candidates sometimes get positions at 5 firms and 3 positions all the time. Literally almost every week we help people get 3s get jobs in 4s, and also 2s get jobs in 3 firms. And it's fun. It's fun when you're able to help people get positions much better firms than they're coming from, and can make a really big difference to them and change their careers. So here's how you can distinguish between different firms. Let me just give me 1 second here. So distinguishing between firms is really using this system is what we typically do. So the law firms ranked to 5 are typically going to be your major national firms with the most criteria. So it's not just a national firm. It's like one of the top national firms. It can also be a top boutique firm, but it's the ones with the absolute highest hiring standards. Most AM law firms are going to be 4s. Some of them are even 3s. Very few of them are 5s. And these are like the most elite firms in the world. They're just extremely hard to get into. And so you think, I would say it would be a 5. Wachtell would be a 5. Some firms are close to a 5, but not quite a 5. There's a lot of really good boutiques that are 5s. I would say probably less than 2% of all law graduates, maybe even sometimes even less than 1%. Well, probably less than 2%. And 1 in 1,000 practicing attorneys with 1 to 5 or 6 years of experience even have the qualifications to get hired by these firms. And they're very hard to get into. They want people that are from the best schools, the best law firms. If they're hiring laterally, some of them are so prestigious that they don't even hire laterally. They just hire law students. And then people that are very stable and committed. Sometimes they'll take a few very high performing people from local law schools who might have done very well in law school. But generally, they're only going to hire attorneys with about 1 to 6 years of experience laterally. So they're not going to really hire beyond that. And they want people that are very smart, that are well adjusted to practicing law, and really just come across as the right type of people. And typically these 5s are not big personalities, and they're just very stable, good workers, and the kind of people that get stuff done. And if they're hiring partners, they typically, I would say it's actually higher than 3 million now. It'd probably be 3 to 5, maybe a little above 3, but they want people to have pretty high billing rates when they hire them. Some of these firms would be like Sullivan & Cromwell, Gibson Dunn, Wachtell, Munger Tolles, Davis Polk. Irell would probably fit in there. Quinn, probably. And when a firm gets very big, Quinn's getting really big, and it becomes harder to stay a 5, because they sometimes have to water their brands and their people down a little bit to stay big. And then lower end 5 firms might be Skadden, Latham, Simpson, Jones Day. They're still 5s, but as they get bigger, it becomes harder for them to maintain standards and the type of people. And these firms have done it, and they have very good brands. So those are great firms, but it's difficult to stay highly ranked as a firm if you have that. And then there's a lot of boutiques around the country, often in litigation, that are people that are formerly with large law firms and may have gone to the best law schools like Yale and Harvard and so forth, that only are going to hire people with the best pedigrees and important clerkships. And those can be 5s too. And there's usually a 5 in most, or at least a couple 5s in every major city in litigation. So if you're a litigator and you think you're a 5, then you probably are familiar with a lot of these boutiques, and there's just a lot of them. And they have very high grade cutoffs. That are meant to keep internally. They want to keep out only the best attorneys. And Gibson Dunn's an example. Like they've rejected attorneys who have been on important like members of presidential administrations because they didn't like their grades in law school, even though the people are in their 60s and stuff, which is funny. So these firms rarely take chances on brands are strong enough, and they just don't need to. And the five firms are generally just very well run. They have outstanding management. They hardly ever lay people off. It's when they do it, their brands take a little bit of a hit. But yeah, they typically also don't force people out when they get senior. They may not give them a title raise or something. They may not improve their title, but they definitely do not push people out the door. They're also very selective in their summer programs, and they represent the most important clients. So the clients are typically major brands in companies, and the people like General Motors and General Mills and Mercedes and so forth that everyone's heard about. And these companies have the money to pay unlimited legal bills. They don't really care if they don't really care. They just will continue paying legal bills, and they're just not that concerned about paying big bills. And they service the most important companies, and take on the most important matters for these companies. And they often don't do contingency work, but sometimes they will, like in high-end patent dispute. Quinn Emanuel, for example, does a lot of that, and some of these other firms do, but they prefer to have, because they have so much income coming in and they're hourly, they prefer to keep that. And they often don't have a lot of client turnover. Their clients stick with them for forever, for a long time. IBM's been with Cravath for forever. The companies will keep their law firms around, and the law firms are seen as the star system. And their bills typically aren't questioned too aggressively. And so candidates that are ranked a 5, like Volkswagen, I think it represents, or Sullivan Cromwell represents Volkswagen. These are big firms with big name clients that really want the best service possible. And if a candidate's a 5, they're typically coming from your firm. They may have gone to a really good law school and done well there, and are in practice areas that are very much in demand. An example would be someone, I'm just trying to think, corporate law or whatever, when corporate law is in demand, these candidates are typically very suited to practicing law. They're professional, they're motivated, they fit in, they're likable, they don't have a lot of issues with their personalities. If they're moving firms, they're typically doing so not because of problems that they're having, and they may be relocating, and that reasons for moving make a lot of sense. If they're partners, they typically have very large books of business, and the business is most often on behalf of large national clients, and the business is typically stable. And if they're associates, they typically are 1 to 6 years of experience, and they typically will go to the best schools, these kind of top schools, but they don't necessarily need to go to the best schools if they do really well at a school. So I have plenty of candidates that went to schools that weren't even the top 100, and they're still 5 candidates because of how well they did, or the firms they ended up in, because they ended up in 5 firms. The firm is the most important. It depends on the school, but a lot of Columbia students, for example, end up at 5 firms because of that, because they're close to New York City. And then a firm ranked a 4 is typically going to be a large national firm. They're an extremely strong regional firm, and so those firms will often have formerly been a 5 if their reputation can take a hit. And then sometimes if they lay off a lot of people, if they can't hold on to attorneys, or they lower their hiring standards, then many times those firms will become 4s. That have been 5s will become 4s. I can think of several firms that's happened to when they just haven't done well in terms of their management, and they typically will have hiring criteria that is not as high as a 5. And I would say maybe 1 in 20 law school graduates, or 1 in 250 attorneys out there have the qualifications to get a job in a 4 firm. So they're pretty hard to get jobs in. It's not, if you think you can work in one of them, then you probably can, but they're just not easy to work in. And the book of business for may be $1 million to $3 million, but it's generally more than that. And these law firms will often lower their hiring standards. They, unlike a 5 firm, if they're hungry and they need people, they'll hire people from lower tier law schools and that don't have, lower firms that don't necessarily have the experience. A 4 firm would be Oric, and that might be a 4. It's just a big national firm. It's close to a 5. Same thing with Wilson Sonsini. Greenberg Traurig is probably a 4. It's got a lot of offices, and it's hard to keep things going. And one of the things too, by the way, of these 5 firms, is, with the exception of Latham and Watkins and a couple of other firms, it's very difficult once a firm starts getting a lot of offices for them to stay a 5. If you look at like Wachtell, for example, they have one office, and Cravath has one office, and Simpson Thacher only has a few offices. And so some of these 5 firms, like the more they expand, the harder it is for them to maintain their status as a 5 firm. It's very interesting to me. Paul Weiss is another one that's probably a 5. Hahnemann Miller, great firm in Detroit. It would be very hard. It's also a local firm. It has national offices, but it's an exceptional firm in Detroit. I would think probably the best firm in Detroit, and is a 4, which is really good for being in that size market. Paul Hastings, Aiken Gump, these are all really good firms. And sometimes if you took just the one office of a firm, if you took just Paul Hastings' Los Angeles office, I would say it would be a 5. It's a really good firm. If you took Aiken Gump's Washington, D.C. office would probably be a 5, but it's just when they expand, their rankings can go down a little bit. And then these firms are also, like your 5 firms, have the ability to make people a partner without any business. But if you don't have business with these firms, they're typically not going to want to keep you around. They have the ability to, but they typically won't. And they tend to have 2 tiers of partnership. So a lot of your 5 firms may just have one type of partner, but your 4 firms will have equity partnerships, non-equity partnerships, and they may, if the attorney doesn't make partner within a couple of years, they may push them out. You just never know. And those firms are often very concerned about attorneys having business, and so they're quite open to lateral hiring, whereas some of your major New York firms, like the best brands there, just do not want to rock the boat. They're very careful about any form of lateral hiring, so they won't bring in a lot of laterals, even at the partner level. And I don't think a firm like Cravath, for example, is not going to hire even lateral associates. It's just not how it works. And then your 4s typically will do a lot of high billable hour work, and they'll rarely cut their fees too dramatically. They'll pay as much as the 5 firms. And then because of that, they get a lot of people wanting to work for them. And they tend to have very good summer programs, recruit from big name schools, but they're often very sensitive to the economy. So when the economy does crater, they're less concerned about their reputation than 5 firms. And so they are often not afraid to lay people off during economic downturns. And then they're also the kind of firms that are very subject to lots of gossip. So when you go on to blogs and gossip sites and so forth, what happens is a lot of the gossip is related to the 4 firms and the 3 firms, and you don't really see people talking negatively about the 5 firms because those firms know how to hire the right people and they're managed for what it is. But the typical client profile of these firms is they're going to represent big caliber clients like the 5s, and they'll also take on smaller mid-sized clients. And they're likely to be national or very strong regional players. Like I talked about Hahnemann in Detroit. The clients of these firms are going to be large national, international companies, and typically lots of mid-sized and smaller companies, even upstart companies. The partners under these firms are under a lot of pressure to bring in business. There's not a lot of institutional clients most of the time. But the bread and butter of these firms are generally going to be large national companies. These firms are going to do a lot of work and may gross billions of dollars a year. But despite their size, typically, a lot of times, the most sophisticated transactions and the very, very most sophisticated litigation won't always go to them. And sometimes it does, but the firms and stuff, the clients that have the ability to choose will often choose the 5 firms instead. And then if a candidate's ranked 4, they typically went to the best law schools, or if they didn't go to the best law schools, they did very well in another law school. Wherever they went, they typically will have worked at a 4 or 5 firm at some point. If they're a lateral, they've almost always worked at a 4 or 5 firm, unless they're in a really desirable practice area. So like right now, say, for example, if corporate was really in demand, 3 candidates could certainly move into a 4 firm, and because the market's just that good for different practice areas. And the candidates that are ranked a 4 will typically have 1 to 6 years of experience. They're typically at a really good firm and their practice area is good. If an attorney is at a top firm and has over $1 million in business, they're generally going to be a 4. They may not be able to get into a 4 or 5 firm, but they're going to be a 4. And it may be a little bit more than $1 million, but once you get that much business, you become a good commodity to hire laterally. Most associates, if they're at a 4 firm, the quality of firm you're at too, by the way, is the most important criteria for how you're ranked. If you're at a 4 firm, then what's going to happen is you're going to be marketable because of your practice area, and if you don't have too many moves. So if someone has moved a lot, like if someone's in their 3rd year of practice and has been at 3 firms, that may actually make them a 3 instead of a 4. And if they've been at their 5th year of practice and they've been at 6 firms, they're almost certainly going to be a 3 because they look like they're going to leave. And then some schools that are attended by candidates ranked at 4 would be, most of your typical Michigan, Penn, Harvard, Duke, Virginia, and those sort of schools in Chicago. Most of the people that want to work in big firms from these schools will end up in a 4 firm if they do well and they interview okay. I mean, that's pretty common for them to do that. And then you have your 3s are going to be national firms with lower billing rates than 4 firms. Lots of regional firms around the country, and they may not have the highest hiring standards, but these are good firms. And I would say 1 in every 3 attorneys probably, or maybe every 4 attorneys has a qualification to work in a 4 firm. But you're still like in the top of the legal profession if you can work in a 3 firm. And 3 firms are very good firms. There's nothing wrong with a 3 firm. There's nothing wrong with a 1 firm. But these firms typically will hire from first tier law schools. So a lot of times people may work at a 4 firm and then they'll go to work at a 3 firm later. Or when they hire, the majority of people have gone to firms that are maybe not the top law schools. So they won't have gone to like a top 10 or top 15 law school, but they can. It doesn't matter. The law firm is going to some extent, be concerned about their academics, but it's not going to be snobby about it. And the people that they hire are in general not going to be like the biggest superstars, meaning superstars that could get a job in a 4 or 5 firm, but they may have some superstars working there. So a lot of very good attorneys work in 3 firms. It's not people choose to go to work in a 3 firm many times because it's the best firm in their region, or they like the people, or the firm offers the kind of lifestyle they want, and all those sorts of things. There's definitely good reasons for someone to work in a 3 firm, and there's nothing wrong with a 3 firm. I think the people that are really good attorneys, like that are capable of working at 4 or 5s, are almost always at some point, if they don't stick around in a 4 or 5 firm, go to a 3 firm and are very happy there and do well. And some of them even go to 2 or 1 firms and are happy there. So there's nothing wrong with a 3 firm. And a 3 firm, most firms, 3 firms are going to be comfortable with someone having 750,000 in business, maybe a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, depending on the market and city. And so the firms that are 3s are going to be places, these are all very good firms, by the way, like Littler Mendelsohn, which is an extremely good, probably the best with Jackson Lewis, labor employment. And then you also have Ford and Harrison, which is also really good. Jackson Lewis is another really good firm. Carl Smith Ball, which is originally a Hawaii firm, Wood Smith and Henning, Trustler. These are all good firms. They're great. They're great places to work. There's a very big firm. Jackson Lewis is a big firm with all sorts of offices, and it does labor and employment. And so it's a practice area that where you don't always need to be have the top qualifications to do employment. So these are all good firms. The other thing about the 3 firms is they always have fairly consistent revenue coming in the door. So what's good about Littler and Jackson Lewis is 2 examples that they always have a lot of revenue, but it's not going to be the same. So Littler has much lower billing rates, and so does Jackson Lewis, because they're national labor and employment firms. And Carl Smith Ball is a smaller firm as well. So they have lower billing rates, but at the same time, the revenue is going to be, so it's going to be less than 4 or 5 firms. And they're probably not going to they typically do not pay as much as the 4 firms. And the salaries may be about 30% less than what the larger ones are paying. Sometimes it'll be even less than that. And the profits per partner are often not that astronomical. So they're not the things where your eyes kind of blow out of your head because they're millions of dollars. They're just, the good profits. And typically, many times the founders of the firm may still be around, the 3 firm and manage it. But many times, the majority of the time, the firm is going to be large and a little bit more institutional in nature. These firms they may have summer programs, they may not. Whereas most 4 and 5 firms always have summer programs. And these firms will represent often local governments, small to mid-sized companies, sometimes larger companies and different types of matters. Like Littler Mendelsohn and stuff represents giant companies, but it does all their labor and employment work, which is lower billing. They represent local hospitals, auto dealerships, and many times individuals. And sometimes they'll do insurance companies and insurance defense litigation, but generally they won't be doing a lot of insurance defense litigation. Most of your insurance defense firms are going to be 2s, but sometimes they will. Gordon & Reese is an insurance firm. To some extent, it's a 2 or 3 firm because it does a lot of other types of work. Labor and employment, work for national franchises and stuff. They may cut their rates. They typically will not charge the highest rates, but sometimes in a local market, a 3 firm that's in, say, I don't know, Arkansas or Detroit or something, they may actually, work for a lot of large companies there. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with the 3 firm. These are all good firms, and they often are just full service practices. So they will do corporate and everything. In the smaller markets, they're more likely to do everything. And then larger markets, they're more likely to do litigation. And then they tend to do a lot less transactional work as a general rule in larger markets, but that's just how it goes. And then if you're a 3 candidate, that means that you're very strong, but generally not that strong in terms of your academics and stuff. You may not be able to get a position in a 4 or 5 firm, but that doesn't really matter. It still means you're a very good attorney, and you can hold your own against four attorneys and 5 attorneys. You can have very good academic qualifications, or you may not. It doesn't always matter, but your academic qualifications are going to be respectable. There's nothing wrong with them, but the things that are typically that make an attorney a 3 as opposed to a 4 are going to be that there's always going to be a few things in your background that make you not suitable to work at a firm that's a 4 or 5. So you may just, who knows what it is. It could be there's just things it's not as perfect. And so you may have not done well in law school, or you may have gone to a poor law school, or you may have a lot of moves, or your just practice area might be in there. You might be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You may never have been a summer associate and trying to get a job, your first job. You may have too much experience, or you may be a partner that doesn't have enough business. And a lot of times, patent attorneys, for example, are almost always 3s because they often didn't go to the best law schools because they were working and they were engineers making a lot of money. So they wanted to stay employed while they were in school. And then they go to local schools because they don't understand, because they were working. And then they often took science classes. So they often will start their careers in small firms and then they'll get hired by bigger firms. But some patent attorneys do have the potential to work in 5 firms, but the majority of them don't. The majority of them are 3s. So there's nothing wrong. And being a patent attorney, by the way, is one of the easiest ways to get a job in a 3 or 4 firm, even if you're a 4. Even if three patent attorneys can often get jobs in 4 firms. So it's a very lucrative practice area. It's just often 3 because of those things. And so most attorneys that are 3s may have gone to national schools or other schools ranked below the top 20. So it'd be University of Indiana, which is a great school, Ohio State, Hastings, another great school, but they tend to go to schools that really aren't the best. And so not the top schools, but that doesn't mean anything. They still can work in really good firms. And it was interesting, like Notre Dame, for example, is a very good law school. And the recent woman that was appointed to the Supreme Court not too long ago that had gone to but some time ago, there was a woman that was appointed to the Supreme Court that had gone to Notre Dame. And I think she was a judge in, I don't know, Indiana or something. But when she had clerked on the Supreme Court, and when she clerked or actually her first clerkship was an appellate clerkship. And then she clerked on the Supreme Court, and they hadn't even, at that level, they hadn't even ever had a Supreme Court from Notre Dame Law School, which Notre Dame Law School is a very good law school. I think it's a top 25 law school, but it just shows you like clerking in the Supreme Court is a very 5 type of thing to do. 5 candidates would clerk in the Supreme Court. The fact that they wouldn't allow someone, and she got a Supreme Court clerkship. But just the point I'm making is that some of these lower ranked schools, it's very hard to get into 5. And even though this woman was top of her class, the best student in her class and stuff, it was still very difficult for her. And so law firms, this is the 2 now, lower ranked firms are typically 2s. They're often going to have lower hiring standards, and most attorneys out there can work in a 2-ranked firm, but not all of them, maybe 80%, maybe it's even a little bit less than that. And the law firms will often have lower billing rates, and the revenue will be inconsistent. So they typically will not have summer programs. They may often be uncomfortable. They may be comfortable places to work, and they also may do very well in their regions. That means that they will, if you're a firm, for example, in Hershey, Pennsylvania, it would be very hard to be a 3 firm in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which is a great market. It's a nice place to work, or Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a marketplace like that. But it's going to be difficult and the salaries in those markets can vary, but generally, these firms, they're going to be fairly low compared to 4 firms or 3 firms, but that doesn't mean they're a bad firm. Again, it's very hard and to be most firms being 2s. It's just that their billing rates have to be lower. Their revenues is going to be a little bit less inconsistent. And that's also one way to think about your 5 firms. Like your 5 firms have clients that will just kind of pay no matter what. And they're just giant clients, and they're bound to the firm, and they're big firms, and they're comfortable. And as you go down the pike in terms of the quality of the rankings of firms, it becomes harder for those firms to get revenue. And the revenue is going to be lower, and it's going to be inconsistent. And they often need to play games to get revenue. And so these firms may be involved in things like insurance defense. They may represent smaller business clients in relatively unsophisticated matters, but sometimes they are sophisticated. They may do some consumer-facing work, personal injury, bankruptcy, criminal law, family law, and things like that. And pretty much the farther down you go, so you start off at the fives where you would almost never represent a consumer. The farther down you go and you get to a two, you're typically going to start having contact with the public, meaning people needing personal bankruptcy or personal injury or family law matters and things. And the billing rates are often going to be lower. And then because you're representing individuals, if I'm an individual, if you're representing an individual, it's very difficult to guarantee that you're going to be able to continually write checks to support that, and to support that person, as opposed to what it would mean if you were not for a company. If you're going to an attorney, just a hypothetical person on this call, and the attorney sends you a bill for $30,000, you're gonna jump out of your skin and you'll be very upset. Whereas a company gets a bill for $30,000, they're not going to care. 50,000 or 100,000. And as you get closer to working for consumers, you have to have lower billing rates, you have to charge less, and all sorts of things. So, and your candidate rank to two is generally going to be average, meaning the majority of attorneys. There's nothing wrong with being a two. You can do great work, but your training may not be as good. You may not see the full picture. You may go through things a little bit fast, miss things, or you may be a good attorney. You could have been a three or four, but you may have made some mistakes earlier in your careers. And I would say that, again, I wrote this in the past. I represent a lot of twos, so I don't know why I would have written this in the past. I think I wrote it because there was, back in the day, that it was very difficult to place two attorneys, but now I do place two attorneys all the time, literally almost every week, so probably every week. So it's not, but most recruiters cannot market two attorneys because you have to really know a lot of smaller firms and places where there's a need for them. But again, the majority of attorneys are two. So if you're a two and you think that you're a two, you shouldn't feel bad. It means that you're just normal. It's like you're not, and you can still be a three or a four oftentimes. But most of the time, twos are doing work for lower paying clients and individuals, and so typically the work is not going to be as sophisticated, and there's not the time to be very thorough. Meaning, if you go to a really big firm and there's a litigation, they'll have all sorts of people writing memos about things and be researching again, and the memos will have to be perfect. And people will make decisions based on memos and other information. And then before things are written, there's a lot of research, and then things are approved again and checked again. And in a two firm, there's just not the money for that. So the attorneys learn different habits, and they're often not as thorough and aggressive, and they don't have the same way of looking at things because the clients can't afford it. That's not to say that it doesn't happen in two firms, because it does, but generally that's how it works. And it's not to say that attorneys are incapable of this. Like an attorney at a two firm could theoretically go to a four firm and become a four attorney or a five attorney, but it's just they haven't been trained like that, and the clients don't have the money to allow people to do that kind of work, and the law firm doesn't have the resources either. And the other thing too, I would say, between the difference between a 2, 3, and 4 or 5 candidate comes down to control. And I'll tell you a quick story. I had a friend, he was actually next to my office when I started practicing a long time ago, Quinn Emanuel, and he had gotten a job at Morrison and Foerster for when he graduated from law school. But he had graduated during a really bad recession, and then he'd been a summer associate there. So what happened to him was one day he came home, and the Morrison and Foerster was going to lay off a lot of its incoming class. And they said, we're going to be laying off a lot of our incoming class. We don't know who, but you can certainly come here and start and take your chances, or you can accept this check. And this is back probably 30 years ago. I don't know how long ago, but you can accept this check for $30,000 and not start here. And so he decided to cash the check, which I probably would have too, and not take a job with Morrison and Foerster. And so the only job he could get was with an insurance defense firm. And Morrison and Foerster, of course, is definitely, I would say, a four firm. And the only job he could get was with an insurance defense firm when he got out of law school. So his first day of work, a partner, this is when he just graduated from law school, took the bar, got the bar, rolled a couple file cabinets in his office and said, these are your cases. You can see me for an hour, or you can make an appointment with me every Friday for a half hour if you have any questions. And he gave him like 50 cases. So that's the supervision that he had when he started. So he literally almost had to learn to practice law himself. And this is how, and I'm not saying that all two firms are like this. It sounds insane, but these are auto accident cases and things that aren't that complex. There's probably wasn't a lot of money involved, but new candidates are definitely more likely to be doing a lot of work without any supervision. They can make mistakes. There's not going to be a lot of oversight. And when you go to when you're at a five firm or you're at a four candidate, there's going to be all sorts of levels of people overlooking your work. A first year associate may be working for a second or third year associate who's working for an eighth year associate who is having their work reviewed by a junior partner or reviewed by an equity partner. And so all this stuff just goes through all these channels and pushing out work that's tight and it's good stuff. And if you're at a two firm, that's not necessarily happening. It's the quality of work. And so obviously, two attorneys, when they get up against four and five attorneys, have a much harder time doing well. And the fact that the two attorney hasn't been controlled and is not necessarily accountable and doesn't learn to walk on pins and needles is something that makes these attorneys weaker. And so they often have a much more difficult time taking criticism, and they often don't get criticism, and they may not learn as much, and they're sometimes not as smart as the four or five candidates. They can be as smart as four or five candidates, by the way. Sometimes people just end up at two firms and are two candidates because they don't learn, but they typically will not work on as sophisticated transactions and so forth as a four or five attorney. And these candidates can come from any law school around the country, and law school performance isn't necessarily that important. But again, I think most attorneys are two candidates. I place two candidates all the time. There's nothing wrong being a two candidate, but the point is learning how to improve. And then a one is typically going to be almost very consumer facing. So it could be a solo practitioner, a smaller town, a firm with inconsistent revenue. And these firms always do not have summer associate programs. So they pay a fraction. In a city like New York City, they might pay 1/5 of what, or sixth of what a major firm there would, a new grad, a young attorney. And this is the majority of firms in the country. It's not, again, there's nothing wrong with the one firm. It's just in terms of the type of attorney and what the expectations are for the attorney, it's just a little bit different than they would be at a three or four or five firm. And so the attorneys there's just, the qualities are different. And a lot of times things are disorganized. And as you go up the chain, you should realize that the way the business of law is being run is better. So the fives and the fours are very well run businesses, and they have a lot of procedures in place, and they're positioned for growth and to do well. And then your one firms typically don't have that business understanding. They're not as organized and in terms of marketing and clients and keeping clients and all this sort of stuff. They're just not there. And these firms often represent consumers. The work that they do for consumers often is that good and may not be as good as a two firm. These attorneys will not give a lot of training. They won't do a lot of thought. So you'll see many times when these attorneys will produce work for a client, they may just, instead of writing a brief, they may just use the court forms and put their arguments on there, because you can respond to a brief on just a court form without lined paper and stuff. And they just will do things a little bit quicker. And that's how most attorneys practice law. So I'm not criticizing this, but obviously if a one attorney goes up against a four or five attorney, the results are going to be predictable. And these attorneys typically go to, if they're lateraling, they won't have gone to the best law schools, which is okay. And they'll often have worked at one law firms. And the law firms that hire them often don't have the highest standards. And by the way, I place plenty of one candidates. I place them all the time too. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them. They just don't always have the qualification to work at a higher ranked firm. They tend to be a little disorganized, and not always. And they're just the majority of attorneys. And they're often very good attorneys. It's just they haven't had the training to be two or three attorneys or even four. And it's just the type of clients, and they can also often just be in the majority of firms in the country. So I hope that was helpful. Certainly, I'm not trying to offend anybody. And what I like about this ranking system is that you do see the way to move up. So if you can move from serving consumers to working for big business, if you can move to all these different kind of places, then you can learn many times to become a thorough attorney. And you can often move from even if you are at a three firm and you move to a one firm, you can bring those habits with you and become a much better attorney with the public, and then win everything you're doing. And it's interesting, in the 18th century, there were three classes. There was the gentry, like the middle class, and the peasantry. And when you were born, you were born into that class. And so if you were born into a very wealthy family, you knew you would pretty much always be wealthy or middle class. And if you were born poor, you almost always stayed poor. And so peasants, the majority of people in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, in that period of time, not the Middle Ages, but in the 18th century, were peasants they farmed land of estates of the gentry, or they were craftsmen. And almost everybody in Western Europe was a peasant. And in the legal profession, I would say 85% of attorneys aren't the ones working in the most prestigious law firms and law schools. And they're doing all sorts of things. They make consumer facing, contract attorneys, and this is the majority of people. So this is a huge number of people. They could work in the government or small companies, I don't know, solo firms. But the thing is that most people believe that they're doomed to being the present class. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then in the middle class in the Middle Ages was 10 to 12% of the population. These are doctors, lawyers, people in military offices. And I would say 10 to 20% of the attorneys now are doing that. And they may be in government in-house and government jobs at the federal level, mid-sized firms and so forth, and that sort of thing. And then the gentry were the 3% of the people. And these are the people working at the largest law. The one thing I would say is that it's very difficult to move from this kind of peasant class to, and it's ridiculous to say that, but to the gentry. And you're often born into it, meaning based on what you come out of law school with. But the thing is, if you want to be in the best firms, there's things you can do, and this is what I teach. And most attorneys, it's unfortunate, but even if you wind up and if you start off in these top 200 law firms, and I think this is probably the lesson here to understand, which I would call the gentry maybe, and most people move down. Most people do not stay in these top 200 or these best law firms if you start there. Very few do, and some people actually do move up. I move people up all the time that stick with me, and I work with from 2 firms to 3 firms and 3 firms to 4 firms, and occasionally 4 firms to 5 firms. And when I say occasionally, much less frequently than 3 to 4. But the thing is that it's very easy to move down, and most people join these big law firms and so forth out of law school, and they don't stay there. They end up with these smaller firms, and so you only have about 6 years to prove yourself. And so it's very important to work as hard as you can, to do the best you can if you want to stay with that and you want to play at that level. And not everyone does, and that's perfectly fine, but you only have about 6 years and sometimes 7. And so I always tell people, and I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call that are at big firms, and that it's important to really not take anything for granted, realize how difficult what you're doing is, because a lot of people are trying to move up and others unhappy. Most people in big law firms end up going to these kind of smaller firms or in-house and that sort of thing. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break just for a couple minutes, and I'll come back and I'll answer questions. I can answer questions again about this or any questions anyone has today about anything to do with your career. And the questions people ask each week tend to be that you can, if you're frustrated at your current job and you want some suggestions, or if you're trying to get a new job and you want some suggestions, if you want to move to a better firm, or you want to move to a smaller firm, or you want to go in-house or in the government, whatever questions you have, I'm happy to answer. And my favorite part of the week, by the way, answering questions, because there's always great questions every week. Yeah, so just 1 minute. Okay, great. So we'll get started with questions. Just give me 1 second here. I'm going to pull them up. I was going to pull up a blank document so I can type out share the questions with everyone. Second here. Okay, so the first question is, let's see here. I am a law student at a top 10 law school. My grades were decent, but not the top of my class. I had somewhat disappointing OCI, callbacks at 4 firms. Can I get back and try to work? Yeah, of course you can get back and try to work in a 4 or 5 firm in a major market. My suggestions would be to do a clerkship if you can with a federal judge. With a federal judge after you graduate, you should apply to all federal judges you can, federal district judges. You can apply to district plus appellate. You'll probably get a district court plus appellate. That will help you. Once you get the clerkship, that'll put you in a whole different league. And I would think if you're going to a top 10 law school, you'll definitely be able to get one. You should try to apply to your home market. So wherever you grew up would be the most important, what I would recommend. You should also think very carefully about why you want to work in New York. So if you're from New York, that's fine, but New York City is not a good market for litigators. New York City is, and the reason for that is that New York City is mainly a finance market. It's not, obviously there's a ton of litigation on there and a lot of important litigation, but it's a much more difficult market to be a litigator in, and there's a lot of fewer opportunities for litigators. In general, it can be very difficult to lateral as a clerk in New York City. I just would recommend to lateral to another firm as a litigator. Right now, for example, there's hardly any openings in New York. It can be a very difficult market. So I would be careful about that. If you have a position as a summer associate in a small market, I would recommend doing whatever you possibly can to get an offer there and working as hard as you can and do the best job possible. You actually may be happier in the long run working in a smaller firm in a small market. Most of the people that I know, I think small markets are great. The reason is because, and I tell this story almost every week, but I clerked for a judge and a federal judge in a not a huge city in Michigan, outside of Detroit. And almost all of the people that I knew that were my age that were working as attorneys, because I met a lot of them through different ways, are all still working in the same firms that they joined out of law school, which may not sound like a great thing to you, but at the same time, almost all the attorneys that I met when I moved to LA and started working in big firms are no longer practicing law. And a lot of them are very unhappy. Some of them died. And it's just, so I think sometimes small markets are a really good place to work. Now, if you want to work in New York City, that's fine. And you can definitely get really good experience there. But the best way to do it is you should also do on-campus interviews and have a story, maybe a story for why you went to work in a small market, a story for why you went to and those are the major things that I would do. Yeah. And let me just see. Yeah, so that's that's it. I would think that you could do your third year, but you should also do mass applications third year to major firms. The other thing too is if you do want to work in a 4 and 5 firm, 4 and 5 firms are easier to work in, get jobs in branch offices and also niche markets. An example would be Perkins Coie is a 4 firm probably, and they have an office in, I think, Idaho. So that would be a much easier office to get a job in than if you were trying to work in their San Francisco office or their Seattle office. Sometimes if you're trying to get a job with a 4 or 5 firm, you should always look at branch offices and then also niche markets and small, I would say, and small, I don't know why I said niche, and smaller markets. So the smaller the market you're looking at, the better off you'll be. You might want to have a story about why you went to work in a small market. So it might be your family's from there, I don't know, something along the line, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, or, friends there, or just different reasons. And there's nothing to prevent you from getting a job in a 4 and 5 firm. And just remember, if you're 25 years old right now, or whatever your age is, you're probably 24, 25, people practice law into their 80s, but actually into their 90s. But conservatively into your 80s. So you're talking about you have 50 plus or 60 years or whatever it is to get into a good firm. I would recommend not to get into a good firm, but a 60 plus year career. So I just, all the rules and things that I teach in these webinars and everything you can learn, anybody that follows this stuff, these are all easy rules that I teach, and you can always get into a major firm if that's really what you want in the long run. It's really not that difficult if you follow the rules, especially if you're starting the way you are at a top. Maybe you just weren't interviewing as well as you could, or who knows, but I would also go back and catalog for yourself what could have done differently in your search, in your interviews and so forth, and then work on that in the future. And then also be broader in your next search. So one of the things is if you did OCI, and only could apply to 50 firms, what would happen? I can talk about this stuff all day, but you just have to think strategically about what you're doing with your search. Don't just use OCI. If you want to be a clerk, if you're a clerk and you get a clerkship, that will make you more marketable. Make you more marketable. 3L is a 3L is actually when you get out of school. Other things too, you could also try, I don't know if you're on law review, some schools light or write on law review. If you light on law review, it's going to be a huge help. Those are just a few of the things you can do. And then that's how I'd recommend it. Okay, so let's see here. So the best way to look for jobs is a 3L. Okay, I spoke with a University of Michigan law student who struck out, worked for the government over the summer, then said he was able to network into a Vault 15 firm by mass mailing partners at law firms and network. Exactly. Sam, is this a reliable strategy, and would you recommend this? If not, what would you recommend for a 3L at an elite school who may have summered at a small firm or not like to go to a law firm? Yeah, you can definitely. Everything is about when law firms are hiring people, what they're really asking. That I always talk about this every week. They're asking you, can you do the job? Will you do the job? Or can you be managed? Will you do the job long term? And then these other ones, do you want the job? And then the other one is, do we like you? These questions, you have to look at these questions and how can you show people this if you're not just necessarily getting jobs. And so, can you do the job? Yeah, you probably can do it if you're smart and you went to this great law school or you went to a good law school. Can you be managed? I don't know the answer to that. Will you do the job long term? I don't know the answer to that either. But if you look committed, that's good. But if you want the job, you're going to do things like that's exactly what you should be doing. So the networking, meaning mass mailing, LinkedIn, contacting individual partners for informational interviews. And I'll tell you a quick story. I do we like you is just if you can connect with a person. People love people though that are trying to get things done or trying to better themselves. But one of the things about this is that if you want the job, you're going to come across as someone, you're going to really be in their face and contacting people and networking and doing everything you can and sending out these mass emails and so forth. And it's I also recommend mass mail, by the way. Actual letters is very effective, but I would do whatever you can to try to get whatever to do the best possible job you can in terms of looking like you want the job. So looking like you want the job is going to be going out there and being very proactive in terms of your search and the people that you're contacting and so forth. And that makes it look, and you should doing networking. I think that's great. There's nothing wrong to doing any of this mass emailing and networking. It's exactly what you should do. And I used to have a company, by the way. The company was, and it's still up when you can look it up online. It was called Legal Authority. And it was a business that helped people mass mail their resumes to law firms, and it worked. Almost everyone that used it got a job. It didn't matter if you were one, two, three candidate, you could get a job with it. And the reason it worked is because this is really law firms love it when people contact them and when people show interest in them, because very few people do that. Most people just apply when there's an opening. And applying when there's not an opening and mass emailing is very effective. Now, in terms of wanting the job and doing and contacting people, the nice thing is informational interview. Informational interview is just saying something like along the lines of, I'm a 3L at whatever law school you're at, 3L, and looking for some advice about working in New York or some advice about working wherever the city is. You contact about working in a given city, whatever, Chicago, New York, wherever it is, and you contact alumni from your school, preferably partners, but like could be associates. And just say, would you have time for me to bring you some coffee? Or would you have time for me to bring you coffee? Sorry, something like that, for a quick chat along those lines. And then you do that. And then another nice thing you can do is you can bring, I don't know if your law school still has it, but you could bring them like some law school stuff, like a sticker, a binder, a newspaper. School newspaper is always fun. If they still print it, I don't know that they are. Just something to remind them of when they were there, and then have an informational interview, and then just ask some questions about what's a good place to look. I understand you probably don't have any jobs, and get to know them. And how do you like practicing in New York? What other markets did you look at? And ask them a lot of questions. And then once you ask them questions, they're going to be curious about you. If you bring them coffee and you bring them a couple inexpensive pieces of paraphernalia, they're going to they're going to like you. And then they're going to want to reciprocate by helping you. So that's one thing that I recommend. I think that it is helpful when you're able to talk to people and give them something, because if you give them like a sticker or a binder or a newspaper or something with a logo on it, they're going to remember you, and it's going to sit on their desk, and they're going to want to do something to help you. And very few people do that. People like it when people do things like ask for informational interviews, because it makes them feel important, and everyone wants to feel important and good. And so that sort of thing can make someone feel important and good about themselves, and it's a good thing. I always recommend doing things like that and then bringing things with you, and just very few people do this. I don't really understand why people aren't more into informational interviews and trying to do that. Because if someone's trying to do an informational interview with you, it makes the person feel important that's being asked to do that, and it's good for you to come to things like this and ask me questions. You're learning things, and I'm trying to help you because you're asking me these questions. And anytime you can do something like that, it's very helpful. It's interesting. We talk a little bit about the energy it takes to be a successful attorney. Things may successful attorneys do to look after themselves. For example, I read one of your articles and all the things successful people do, such as daily goals, getting massages, morning routines, etc. I'm asking because I can't seem to work as hard as I want to without really becoming really tired, even losing motivation. So it's really interesting. Thank you. I love this question. This is a fun question. Okay, let me tell you Harrison's schedule in terms of what I do and how I stay motivated, because I'm pretty motivated. So what I do typically is I get up around 4 a.m. every day. So I've been up right now for a long time. I get up at 4 a.m. and I'll take a shower and stuff, and then I'll do yoga for 1 hour when I get up typically. And so I'll typically finish that around 5:30 because finish yoga because finish actually 5 to 5:30, from 4:30 to 5, 4:30 to 5:30 a.m. to 5:30. So I take a shower and stuff, and thankfully very close to my office. So do that. So that will be, and all of my motivation stuff will here in a minute. And by the way, I've seen a lot of very successful attorneys do that. Then 5:30 to 6. And this is a fun question. I don't know why anybody's asking it, but that's fine. 5:30 to 6 a.m., I will plan my day. I do a couple different things. I used to use a different type of planning thing, but I actually have this on my desk. I use this thing called a productivity planner. And so what I do with that is that at the beginning of my week, I always write out 15 things I need to do. I review my week, and then every day I have different things that I do that I plan to get through. I also use a 5-minute journal, which is I set goals. I say what I'm grateful for. So that's actually the first exercise I do. So every morning I write out things I'm grateful for. Then I also write out what would make today great. And then I have some affirmations that I do, and that puts me in a good state of mind. And then I also do this thing, which is called Better Every Day, which is fun. And it has every day you write like a little essay about different things that are important. So like this today was, you must either shrink your dreams or expand your skills. So I wrote about that. Like yesterday was, your adversities are your advantage. And so I'm always finished with that at 6 or by 6 a.m. done with journaling, etc., planning. And then from 6 a.m. So this is, and then at 6 a.m. we have an office in India. I do meetings with Asia staff from 6 a.m. until usually 8 a.m., 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. And then I do what happens after that. And then 8 to 10, 8 to 9, 10, I do meetings with 8 to 9 US meetings, and then 9 to 12:30, or 9 to 12, usually 9 to 12. I do recruiting related activities, recruiting related placement stuff. And then from 12 to 2:30, 12 to 3, this is what you'll find interesting. I run and I meditate for an hour. Then 3 to 6, typically more meetings. Those are staff meetings. And then 6 to 7, I will go on group mentor meetings, or group kind of mentor spiritual type meetings where I help people with stuff. Then from 7 to 8, dinner, family time. This is just during the week. I'm just going to give you an example. Dinner. And then 8 to not 8 is bedtime. So that's my schedule, which is also, I also do light journaling and meditation. Usually sleep by 9:30. That's my schedule, and so my advice is you have to break up your day into periods of where you're being inspired. You have to have meetings. Obviously, if you're working, I'm pretty busy all day. This is my weekly, what I do during the week. And then the weekends, Saturday, I typically will work from 4 a.m. and then take the rest of the day off. And then on Sunday, I will typically from 4 a.m. 11 a.m. I will do writing and so forth. So that's how I break up my schedule. But these are the routines. Oh, and then yeah, and then you talk about massages. So I do have different things that I do. So Mondays I get massages at 5:30. Yeah, so that's about it. So Mondays massage 5:30 for 90 minutes. Yeah, so that's it. So the things is I can continually stay motivated, and this really does help me with motivation. Other things that I do to keep myself motivated are at least one time I do like a book group where I read one time a month for 4 hours. And then I do, what else do I do? Coaching. So I have coaches that I talk to. So I get coached, which I recommend for anybody to try to get coached. I do that one time or 2 times a month. CEO coach, and then yeah, so that's about it. So you have to try to break things up. I used to do religious stuff on Sundays, but I don't really do that anymore. But I try to build in the idea for any schedule is you want a physical activity. I think is very important. Then you want to build in mental activity. You want to build in spiritual activity, and you also want to build in reflection time. All of these things help me do that, and so that's why the yoga is a spiritual type exercise, but it's also good just to get your blood flowing. This is to plan your day. To have gratitude is important because you're excited. I'm excited for every day, and then these are different meetings and stuff that I have, and these are awesome. That's my schedule, and you have to get a good night's sleep too. So sleep really does help you, and you have to sleep. So I actually track my sleep. This is this band here, so I track that as well to make sure I'm getting enough sleep and the quality of my sleep. And I also track my exercise to make sure I'm not exercising too much. So I hope that helps. If you have any more questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. No one's ever asked me that at a meeting, but I do believe that in terms of how you schedule your day and time, it does make a difference in terms of what you can contribute. And most very successful people have certain habits that they follow. And then you also have, of course, you have other things there's other things that I do to give myself energy. So I certainly do things. Other things are, vitamins, but I take vitamins like B vitamins, no alcohol or drugs, which slow you down. I'm trying to think of what else. Drugs, B vitamins, what else? Yeah, those are, oh, and then diet. So diet, you try to watch things like too much sugar. I mean, I certainly will eat lots of stuff, but that, and then those are things. And then just from a personal standpoint, never going to bed angry. So you should never go to bed angry with your mate, angry with your, and then try to resolve any issues you have before then. Don't go to sleep mad at someone. And those are the big things. So all this stuff, if you want to be successful and have a lot of energy to help other people, and like I do, it requires a lot of energy to do all this and to try to help candidates and stuff. It can make a huge difference. And so this is the schedule that I follow. And then on Saturdays, I will typically, this is my schedule there. And then Sundays, that. And then of course you have exercise, and then which is usually 10 to 12. And then time with kids, usually. And then this is for then time with kids. Oh, it's the time with kids mate. Actually, my time with kids is that's all I got with kids, girlfriend. So it's a pretty action-packed schedule. And then just in terms of diet, great food. All right, so that's that. So let me do this next question here. But thank you. But yeah, having the energy to give is important. One of the things that I realized, and one of the reasons for this sort of aggressive schedule, is when I started noticing several years ago, a lot of my friends dying, and they were people that I'd grown up with. They were people that I practiced law with, and certainly none of this is going to necessarily mean I won't die at some point in the near future, but I mean, you never know. But at the same time, you need to take as good a care of yourself as you can to have more energy to give. And if you make those kind of choices and do things, then hopefully you'll live longer, but also you'll enjoy your time here much more as well. I work in a closely held family company. I have a long-term contract for their operation. I went to a regional, mostly unknown school, but since being admitted to practice in 2002, I've completed 2 LLMs, one from Northwestern, one from Georgetown, securities. What else can I do to join a big firm, or even better, go in-house to a major company? Okay, you're saying even better, go in-house to a major company. So that means that's what you want to do. So I think you're in good shape. I don't know. You seem like you're interested in securities, and I would think that's what you should do. If you want to do securities, it would probably be smart to go to a firm that is pre-IPO maybe, or needs securities help, or someone to be a securities attorney. You've been out of school for a while, so 2002 is at least a couple of decades. So I would recommend doing what you can to maybe, if you want to, I don't know if these are both securities LLMs and if they're all both recent, but I would think that if you just continue applying to in-house positions, you'll be in good shape. And what I would recommend for in-house positions would be, I wouldn't recommend law firms because you've been out of school for too long. Even if you were at a big law firm right now and only had been out since say 2000, had been 7 or 8 years out, you would still have, well, actually, yeah, 7 or 8 or 10 years out, you would have a hard time. You're just too far out to get into a big law firm at this point. Everybody that's graduated back then is. So it's, unless you had a big book of business. But I think you're a great in-house candidate. Many times, what I like that about working in-house is I think that it seems like you're already in-house, and it doesn't matter if it's a closely held family company or not. You probably have very good experience. And so I think one of the things I would recommend would be networking with companies. I think networking with companies and other closely held family companies even could be useful, because that would help you. I would think that could help you get a job because you have experience in the sorts of challenges. But if you do want to work in a larger company, I would recommend networking. One of the big things a lot of times with people that have worked in-house or like you're doing is that their background may not necessarily be perfect. They may have like very varied experience. And so what I would recommend in terms of your experience would be, when you take your resume, don't have a million different things going on there. Try to position your resume so it looks like you're a good candidate for whatever the company you're applying for. So if they have a need for a securities attorney, don't put a lot of superfluous stuff on there. Put whatever securities experience you have and try to lead with that. That would be my advice. But I don't think you'll have too much trouble. Here, the next question: is the market for litigators in New York City likely to change soon, or open to at all? Or will it basically be impossible if I didn't summer in the big firm there? I think that the market for litigators in New York City will change. Things go in cycles there. So right now it's not that great, but typically when the economy is good, litigation is not as active a practice area. And when it gets bad, it becomes a much better practice area. So it just depends on you, but I think that it depends on the timing. But there's just the problem with litigation is that litigation is the most popular practice area. So most attorneys are litigators. So it's much more difficult to distinguish yourself as a litigator than in other practice areas. So you have to, it means there's just, because there's so many of you there, it's much more difficult. So you need to have exceptional qualifications, exceptional rare qualifications, or you need to, have niche experience or something along those lines. So I actually recently been placing more family law litigators and medical malpractice, med mal, insurance attorneys in New York attorneys. So it's just that's just the way it is. An exceptional rare qualification for great clerkships. So the other way you can do is, if you don't want to work in New York City. And New York City, by the way, is the financial capital. So most attorneys there are finance attorneys. So that's where the demand is for finance related stuff. And then I'm just trying to think of the final thing I wanted to put down here. Yeah, that's about it. So as a litigator, you can distinguish yourself by going to smaller markets, times, or those are just some ways. So it's just difficult because you have to understand. So if you were like an ERISA attorney, for example, there might be 50 or 100 of you in New York, but if you're a litigator, there's going to be tens of thousands maybe. So it's much more difficult as a litigator. And so I don't think it's going to change very soon, but it may. But when the economy slows down, then there is more demand. And if you're in a niche market, like I can place people that are in niche markets, but those aren't big firm jobs or niche practice areas. Okay, would it be a bad idea to email partners who interview with OCI and connect with them, maybe didn't make the grade cutoff for? Sure, but they're not going to remember you. But you can email them and tell them you did interview them. But yeah, I think typically when someone rejects you, it's better just to move on. It's such a big market out there and there's so many jobs. In terms of the networking though, oh, I'm sorry, I don't think I understood your question. Yeah, you could email them and ask them if they have any suggestions of other places you're going to work, tell them where you finally got a job, and just see if they have any other suggestions of places you could apply. That's how I would deal with that. Is mailing or even mass mailing okay for experienced attorneys? Yeah, mass mailing is great for experienced attorneys. It works. I don't know how many times to say this. I don't mean that in a negative way, but I've been telling attorneys for 20 plus years to mass email because it works, and it works wonders. It's something that most attorneys don't do. They're afraid to do. And especially with letters, and especially direct letters to partners inside of firms, it works great. And if you do that and you do enough of it, you will get a job doing that. And it's much easier, because the reason it works is because very few attorneys will send out are doing it, and because of it, your resume and stuff sticks out and it's seen. And you're applying to firms that don't necessarily have openings. And if you're applying to a firm that doesn't have an opening, then they don't have to advertise in order to bring you in, and you look like you're interested in the job. There's just all sorts of reasons that it's a great idea, and I wish everyone did it, and because a lot more people would get jobs. And if you're one of our candidates on this call, which I know a lot of people are, certainly we try to recommend you apply to as many places as you possibly can, because it just makes a huge difference. In the initial 5 years of a career, were at least 3, probably 4 law firm, and then subsequently had other experience, for example, government or experience, what is the best way to convey how the type of training and skill developed you mentioned is a characteristic of the level 4 firm? I'll mention characteristic. Is it moved because of the other experience, because to lose the value or a law firm experience and now consider a lower caliber attorney? I know I've maintained those skills and developed additional skills in the online firm work, but I have the sense it's not valued. Okay, well, the big thing is I went back to, I talked about these 4 things earlier, but I will come back to them, and they're important. So these are the questions that the law firm's asking, and when they're hiring you, they're asking if you can do the job, can you be managed, will you do the job long term, do you want the job? So the problem with people that go in-house is the can you do the job means your skills may be different now than they were when working for a law firm. So everyone knows, what if you work at a AmLaw 100 law firm, everyone within reason knows the expectation. But in contrast, most in-house companies, government, no one knows. So that's the problem. So the training, they don't know. Can you be managed? They don't know that. Long term, the idea is if you went in-house once, or if you left a law firm once, and this is how the law firms think about it. And then in terms of, do you want the job? Why did you leave the law firm? Those are just some of the things. Would you still be a 4 or 5 candidate even though you were there? Possibly. You could still possibly be a 4 or 5, but it's what hurts your rankings, the way that they believe they may be, all things considered, if they're comparing you to someone that's also currently in a law firm, and they're going to know your skills could be diluted in another environment. That's one thing. The other thing is they don't know if you want to stick around. So that's another thing. And then they don't know if you really want the job. And so the problem is then all these things, if you're comparing yourself to someone that's currently in a law firm, then that makes you a little bit like not as desirable necessarily as someone that's currently in a law firm. And so that's one of the challenges, is once you leave a law firm environment, then they start looking at you this way, and that can disqualify you. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your background. It just means that you're not as good of a candidate as someone that's currently coming from a law firm, and they're probably looking at people that are from law firms for the same jobs. The problem. These are great questions. I just love these questions. It makes my week it's such a good time answering them, because they're such good. These questions just help so many people do them. Okay, I'm currently a first-year staff attorney at a big law firm working in tech transactions and M&A deals. I have a low billable requirement, and then I only bill 6 to 7 hours a day. That's great. Is to bill more hours, like 8 to 12 hours a day, a good indication that you're ready as an associate? What are good indications that someone is ready to handle an associate level position? I would think, that the more hours you can build, the better. It's not necessarily about hours. It's about the sophistication of the work you're given. I would, if I was a staff attorney, what I would do is I would work as hard as I could at the firm. So I would, work as many hours as I could. I would be as thorough as possible. I would ask questions and keep learning. I would be hungry. I would keep learning. I would compare my work to associates. I would be visible in the firm. And then I would learn. I put in learning, and I would do all those things, and I would make it. I continued improving and improving, and eventually, when they looked at me and they compared me to associates that were making a lot more money than me that had those titles, they would think that I looked more like an associate, and I probably wouldn't ask for that. I would give myself like a 1-year runway to do really well and to do everything I could, and I would work harder. And the final one is I would do a good job with sophisticated assignments. I wouldn't count my hours, just work hard. And I would find a mentor if I could. So if you do all those things, that's going to help you. And staff attorneys can move into those roles all the time. The only thing is you do need to make sure that you're working on sophisticated work. A lot of times staff attorneys will do work that's not as sophisticated. So you want to work on a sophisticated assignments and do a really good job with them, and then just continually improve. And the more you improve, the better off you're going to be. Let's see. Questions about reapplying to law firms you were rejected. Is reapplying to law firms you were rejected from earlier feasible? If I blanket about 100 law firms for some associate job, was late in the game and didn't get hired with them, will I be able to get a job? No, you can always keep applying as many times as you want. There's nothing. Most law firms do not save applications. They don't care if you applied in the past. Some of them do save. You can apply as many times as you. There's nothing wrong with that. You can just keep doing that. And they won't remember you. And it's just everything. Law firms, everything is a moving parade. So sometimes they're interested in you, sometimes they're not. It just depends on when you apply. But you can definitely, just because you're rejected once doesn't mean anything. Sometimes you're just rejected because the job's filled. It doesn't mean there's any specific reason why you're rejected. All right, 1 second here. Okay, with mass mailing, I assume the cover letter focuses mainly on the qualifications and not the firm specifically. No. Yes. So that's no. No one cares about you. So that's the first thing. They'll look at your resume, and I don't mean that in a negative way that no one cares about you, but you definitely want to focus on the firm. So when we represent candidates at BCG, we do cover letters for them. And those cover letters always have information in them about, let me just see here, and I was just looking at something that I was going to show you here. But those cover letters, when we do them, we always have things in here where we tell every law firm that we apply to is precisely why one of our candidates are applying. So we don't just blanket the market. Let me just blow that up for you so you can see it better. But this is just something that we do at BCG for all of our candidates. And this is something that we tell candidates before we're helping them. But we prepare professional applications, and then we tell every firm precisely why the person's applying to that firm. And we give a detailed reason, and then we also tell them can the person do the job? What we like about the person. So does the firm like you? Want them to like you? Will you do the job long term? Why are you manageable? So we always put those things in our cover letters. But the big thing is you do need to do whatever you can to tell the firm why you're applying to them. And that's not a mass. I mean, people will still read your mass letters and resume, but your resume should not be talking about your experience. Your cover letter should make the person like you, but it should basically tell the law firm exactly why you're applying. Very important. So that's a good question. And I'm just going to put down here. I'll just copy that quickly. Very important. So yeah, do not just tell people about your experience. And that's just if some guy approaches you on the street and just starts telling you about how great he is, you're just not going to, that just doesn't connect with your audience. So you need to be very good about that. Okay, these have been great questions, by the way, so far. Let me just see here. There's a couple other questions. There's one here. Person asked, without criminal defense attorney for 12 years. One of the good ways I don't know why you want to be a healthcare attorney, but sometimes people will get LLMs. You can do medical malpractice. Sometimes you do that. You can apply to smaller firms that might have an interest, and you can, join, you can network. Those are just some other ways, et cetera. So those are some ways you can do that. And here is the final question, which is a fun one. It's from an attorney in Guatemala. I graduated from one of the best universities in Guatemala. Do I have a chance to be hired from a good law firm here in the US? What do I need to do? The first thing you need to do is you need to get probably like an LLM and something that you probably also, I would recommend if you really want to be an attorney in the US, go to a 3-year law program at a law school. So meaning you go to like just a regular law school, attend law school here. And law firms want the ability to evaluate you compared to other people that went to school. And that's really, most people are better off getting a 3-year law program. It's much harder to get a job in the US if you don't necessarily have that. All right, man. Great. Thanks for the webinar today. I appreciate everyone's questions, and we'll be back next week. And we also do a presentation tomorrow at the same time for law firms. So some people enjoy being on that, and if you do, then I will talk to you then as well. Thanks.